with my Read Aloud in series, Indian Economic Development, textbook for class 11, chapter 4, Poverty, unit 3, Current Challenges Facing the Indian Economy. So here I'm going to read about the poverty line. So let us examine how to determine the poverty line. So that's an imaginary line, but then it's how do we determine it? It's very interesting. There are many ways of measuring poverty. One way is to determine it by the monetary value per capita expenditure of the minimum calorie intake that was estimated at 2,400 calories for a rural person and 2,100 for a person in the urban area. Based on this, in 2009-10, the poverty line was defined for rural areas as consumption worth rupees 673 per person a month, and for urban areas it was rupees 860 per month. Though the government uses monthly per capita expenditure MPCE as proxy for income of households to identify the poor, do you think this mechanism satisfactorily identifies the poor households in our country? Scholars state that a major problem with this mechanism is that it groups all the poor together and does not differentiate between the very poor and the other poor. Also, this mechanism takes into account expenditure on food and a few select items as proxy for income. Economists question its basis. This mechanism is helpful in identifying the poor as a group to be taken care of by the government, but it would be difficult to identify who among the poor need help the most. There are many factors other than income and assets which are associated with poverty. For instance, the accessibility to basic education, healthcare, drinking water, and sanitation. They need to be considered to develop poverty line. The existing mechanism for determining the poverty line also does not take into consideration social factors that trigger and perpetuate poverty such as illiteracy, ill health, lack of access to resources, discrimination or lack of civil and political freedoms. The aim of poverty alleviation schemes should be to improve human lives by expanding the range of things that a person should be, that the person could be and could do, such as to be healthy and well nourished, to be knowledgeable and participate in the life of a community. From this point of view, development is about removing the obstacles to the things that a person can do in life, such as illiteracy, ill health, lack of access to resources, or lack of civil and political freedoms. Though the government claims that higher rate of growth, increase in agricultural production, providing employment in rural areas and economic reform packages introduced in the 1990s have resulted in a decline in poverty levels, economists raise doubt about the government's claim. They point out that the way the data are collected, items that are included in the consumption basket, methodology followed to estimate the poverty line, and the number of poor are manipulated to arrive at the reduced figures of the number of poor in India. Due to various limitations in the official estimation of poverty, scholars have attempted to find alternative methods. For instance, Amartya Sen, noted Nobel laureate, has developed an index known as a Sen index. There are other tools such as Poverty Gap Index and Squared Poverty Gap. You will learn about these tools in higher classes. So next is 4.4, paragraph heading, the number of poor in India. When the number of poor is estimated as the proportion of people below the poverty line, it is known as head count ratio. You might be interested in knowing that the total number of poor persons residing in India. Where do they reside, and has their number or proportion declined over the years or not? When such a comparative analysis of poor people is made in terms of ratios and percentages, we will have an idea of different levels of poverty of people and their distribution between states and over time. The official data on poverty is made available to the public by the Planning Commission. It is estimated on the basis of consumption expenditure, data collected by the National Sample Survey Organization, NSSO. This chart shows chart 4.3, which I'll be showing you, the number of poor and their proportion to the population in India for the years 1973 to 2010. In 1973-74, more than 320 million people were below the poverty line. In 2004 and 5, this number has come down to about 300 million. In terms of proportion, in 73-74, about 55% of the total population was below the poverty line. In 2009-10, it has fallen to 30%. In 1973-74, more than 80% of the poor reside in rural areas, and in 2009-10, this has come down. This means that more than 3/4 of the poor in India still reside in villages. Why do you think this is the case? In 1990s, the absolute number of poor in rural areas had declined, whereas the number of their urban counterparts increased marginally. The poverty ratio declined continuously for both urban and rural areas. From chart 4.3, you will notice that during 1973 to 2010, there has been a decline in the number of poor and their proportion, but the nature of decline in the two parameters is not encouraging. The ratio is declining much slower than the absolute number of poor in the country. You will also notice that the gap between the absolute number of poor in rural and urban areas got reduced, whereas in the case of ratio, the gap has remained the same until 1999. 2000 has widened in 2004 to 10. Let us examine this graph. It shows that the number of poor and their proportion to the population in India for the years 73 to 2010. So taking both urban and rural, you see that more than 320 million people, if you take this and this, it's about 320 million people were below the poverty line. In 2004 and 5, this number has come down to about 300 million. But if you're talking in terms of proportion, in 73, 74, about 55% of the total population was below poverty line. 55%, okay. 2009 to 10, it had fallen to around 30%. But of course, it was also found that in 1973-74, more than 80% of the poor resided in rural areas. And even now, around more than 3/4 of the poor in India still reside in villages. Just to demarcate rural from urban, I've put the rural in green. So in this chart, we will see population below poverty line in say 1973, which is the black one, and in 2009-10, which I've shown with this, lined it up with this green marker. So let's just see. Just looking at you, we know that initially, see in Andhra Pradesh, look at the gap. So people under population below poverty line has been reduced to quite an extent. Bihar, very little. So Gujarat, there is a perceptible. Again, Karnataka, there is. Madhya Pradesh, not so much. In between those 2 years, and then we have Orissa, there is quite a bit of it. Then Rajasthan also shows. Tamil Nadu shows quite a bit. That means poverty line, people under poverty line 55, now it's come down to 17. So that shows some amount of progress out there. Then you have Uttar Pradesh, not much. Then you have West Bengal, yes, it shows quite a bit. And in the notes it's written, for the year 1973, Uttar Pradesh includes the present Uttarakhand, Madhya Pradesh includes Chhattisgarh, and Bihar includes Jharkhand. So this is what we've done. We just went through the state level trends in poverty line that we just saw in the chart, and we saw what it revealed was that in some states there has been a perceptible decline, but in some it has not. So the next reading that I'll do in the class, it is what causes poverty.